The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets about what matters most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Karen Swallow Prior is an English professor and the author of On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. It won Publisher Weekly's Best Book of 2018 in the category of religion. Justin Taylor said that few teachers are this clear, compelling, and Christ-centered. When you hear this conversation, you'll know what he means. Karen Swallow Prior, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Here's where I want to start our conversation, and we'll just kind of go from there. You are on kind of a one-woman campaign to elevate the reading habits of especially American Christians, it seems. And I was thinking about the advice that writers often get, especially people who are giving advice to young writers, encourage them to read more, that writers are readers, that kind of thing. As I have thought about that advice, to me it feels a little bit like giving a teenage boy the advice to make sure you eat 3 meals a day and have some snacks in between. Writers seem like, I kind of work from the assumption that writers are already readers. And my problem tends to be to stop reading and start writing, to stop being a producer. Mm-hmm. Stop being a consumer and flip the switch and become a producer. So what are your thoughts on what writers should be reading, how they should be, or do writers need to be reading differently from other people?
Yeah, I have thoughts. I have so many thoughts. So, I think in a way there are two kinds of writers. There are true and good writers, like you just described yourself, who love language and love the craft of language, and that means you are a reader, because that's it's like being a painter, and you don't just paint, you look at the masters, mm-hmm. And take inspiration from them. But then there is a whole other brand of writers. I think they've always been around since we've had the printing press, but social media has certainly expanded their numbers, and those are people who want to be published authors. Mm-hmm. Whatever that means. Yeah. And they just, they want to spill their thoughts out onto the page because they think everyone should see them, just like the selfies on Instagram. but they don't necessarily love the craft of language. They don't, haven't even studied it. I mean, I guess I think any discipline or field would probably find those, kind of people in it who, the person who wants to be an NBA star but doesn't want to practice dribbling or something.
Right.
Right. So I think that, and then I think there's maybe a group in the middle that doesn't quite see the connection, then maybe the potential lovers and crafters of language and words who have to understand the connection. So maybe there are sort of three different groups. So I think it is something that we do have to talk about, the importance of reading to the writer.
How do writers need to be reading? That's kind of a broad question.
I think, no. I mean, in my first book to Literature and the Soul of Me, in the first chapter, I talk about being a young PhD student and having a professor introduce me to John Milton's work Areopagitica, which is basically an argument for, his own Puritan conservative Christian people to read widely, or he uses the 17th century word, which is promiscuously. So, which is, literal, it doesn't have to have the sexual connotation. Although that works too. But, so read widely. We all have the things that we prefer to read, myself included, but we need to stretch ourselves. And what we read really does shape our understanding and use of language. I mean, I read a lot of 18th century British literature because that's my specialty. Mm-hmm. And so you will see the convolution in my sentences. I'm not saying that's a good thing,
right?
But I love my complicated clauses and my em dashes and so forth. Now I try to discipline myself and offset them with short sentences. But I mean, 18th century British language is just seeped into my soul and into my writing because I read so much of it. Right. Just on Twitter the other day, I used the word knave, Knave, and I got lots of applause for it. And I'm like, for bringing that word back. And I'm like, I didn't know it was gone because it's such a great funny 18th century word. So we do need to be intentional in what we read and read widely and understand that what we're reading will affect the way that we think and the way we use language.
Mm-hmm. What do you do to counteract your 18th century tendencies in sentence structure?
Well, I've read some great style books. That's not always the most fun reading, although it can be if you get some of them are well written. And I have over time, this is something a lot of writers will talk about, and so this isn't anything new, but I'll admit that it's kind of a struggle for me. The reason I'm Baptist is because I have no rhythm. I can't even clap in time. So, no, that's not really true. There's trolls out there. There are other reasons too, but why I'm Baptist. But I'm someone who doesn't, rhythm doesn't come naturally to me. And so this idea of, developing a writing voice and hearing with your ear the rhythms of your writing and your style, that's something I've had to work very hard to develop through lots of writing and lots of paying attention to that. And so for others that might come more easily, but I've really tried to develop my ear for writing and paying attention to the rhythms of my prose so that it has a good rhythm. And even though I can't clap in time.
Do you read your sentences out loud a lot?
I don't anymore. I think I did very early on, and it is something that I encourage people to do, but I hear my own voice so much in my head that I don't have to literally do it out loud. But again, that ability also has come with lots of practice and intentionality. So
I'm sure. Your idea of a voice emerging, I think it's especially interesting for people who have, like you, who have done a lot of writing in the academic realm. Mm-hmm. Where you're rewarded for speaking in a voice that doesn't sound like your actual voice. Mm-hmm. What has that been like to bridge from academic writing over into a more popular writing? Have you run into issues there?
That's a good question. I will, another confession. I remember being so devastated. One of my first or second semesters, I think, in my PhD program, and I got a paper back from my professor, and she wrote on it that my writing was very inelegant.
Huh.
And I thought, I was one of those kids who always got A's in English in high school and always got A's in college and, undergrad, and then went into a PhD program, and was totally blown away. And I thought, no one ever told me my writing should be elegant.
Yeah.
And I was devastated. It still hurts to say it now, all these years later, but that was a turning point for me. And so I look back at my dissertation now, which is 20 years old, and I think, well, it's not very elegant, but it's better. And then I think that line between my academic writing and my public writing, or that gap, has narrowed, and that's a good thing, because there is a movement within academic writing to there's so much bad academic writing, and it doesn't need to be bad. It can be technical, and it can be deep, and it can be philosophical, but it does not have to be bad writing. And there's a great book by Helen Sword called Stylish Academic Writing, I think is what it's called.
Oh, I don't know that book. I'd love to see that.
It's fantastic, and I'm totally team Helen Sword.
Well, I know I have a PhD in 17th century literature, and I felt like I had to...
I did not know that.
I do, yeah.
How did...
Milton.
Well...
Yeah.
Well, wow! Go ahead. You take over the show.
Well, I
bow at your feet.
I felt like I had to unlearn when I decided I wanted to be, the other kind of writer besides an academic writer. I felt like I spent a lot of time unlearning some habits. I don't know that maybe I shouldn't say I spent a lot of time. I just read Flannery O'Connor and kind of got came back to gospel sanity. It was almost like I spent the first many years of my intellectual life trying to leave Middle Georgia and learn how to, talk Milton, and then Flannery O'Connor brought me back to Middle Georgia. And
she brought you home.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I want to.
So, can we geek out for a few minutes here? I hope the audience doesn't mind. But that's interesting because 17th century poetry and prose is much. I talked about 18th century being convoluted, but actually, in comparison, it's much. It's especially the neoclassical, the really properly neoclassical writers of the 18th century really did aim for clarity and simplicity and balance and symmetry, very, very much in contrast to someone like Milton. So maybe those 18th century writers didn't do me as wrong as I was kind of joking earlier about. So.
Yeah. One thing that has changed in my way of thinking about reading and writing since I was reading for a PhD in 17th century literature is that I was so impressed with those poets. John Donne. He is so impressive, and I'm still impressed by John Donne and those poets of that era. And their wit, but I don't. But I realize that being impressed and loving aren't quite the same thing. And so when I read John Donne, I think, boy, isn't John Donne a clever guy? But John Donne doesn't change the way I think about the things he writes about, the way other writers might. And so I'm still as impressed as I ever was with John Donne, and I think he's just a genius. But I keep thinking about John Donne when I read John Donne instead of the things John Donne is talking about. Now, his sermons really do move me quite a bit, and in a lot of his, I should also say that his the sonnets, the holy sonnets. I'm going to make an exception for those, but his metaphysical, those sort of love poems. I'm so impressed with that poem, The Flea, but it has not changed the way I think about the flea. It hasn't changed the way I think about fleas, and it hasn't changed the way I think about sex. It's just impressive. And so, in academic writing, whatever else you're saying in academic writing, the one thing you're always saying is, be impressed with me, give me tenure, move me on to the next level of my career. And I think that's one of the dangerous things, the fact that we all learn writing in an academic setting. The way we learn to write is always in terms of, what is this going to do for me? And I felt like that was something I had to unlearn when I wasn't an academic anymore. And by the way, Karen, I know you're an academic. It sounds like I'm picking on all academics, but
no. These are real problems.
But academic writing, not almost, by design, is, ideally you can sort of marry, I'm passionate about this subject and I want people to know about it, and also I want to advance myself in some way, either to the next grade if I'm a student, or to the next level of my career if I am a professor. And that's a best case scenario. But in many scenarios, the self promotion is the more important of those factors. When I teach writing to adults, I feel like I'm having to deprogram some of those ways of thinking about writing, what I'm going to get out of it.
Well, and it's interesting because it's really not that different even out on the internet, right? I had never made the connection before, right? The clickbait and the platform building. It's a different set of rules and different level, but it's not that different there either. So it's so easy to fall into the trap of writing for oneself, or writing for self-promotion, as opposed to writing as a gift to the world. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, because I want to talk about in your recent book on reading well. It's a book about virtue, and about how we grow in virtue if we read well. And I'm especially interested in the idea that you are working through virtue and telos, or our end, a purpose that we didn't invent for ourselves. And I'm not sure if you were quoting somebody else or if this was you. You were talking about the idea that the emotivism that has replaced virtue appropriates the language of morality, and so becomes sort of an eviscerated version of virtue, that reading can give us back a truer sense of virtue, wherein we get in touch with what's actually real and true and good and beautiful in the world. I hope that's a fair summation of your ideas.
Yeah, the first part of that, the idea of emotivism replacing true virtue, comes from Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. Right. But then the rest of it, the whole project of my book is to talk about how reading is a tool in helping us to find our way back to real virtue.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'd like to check in with you about is the idea that it's not the writer's job to create meaning, invent meaning, even the fiction writer's real job isn't to create an alternate reality, but rather to point us to realities that the writer didn't invent. As Jamie Smith says, any attempt to create our own reality is not only doomed to fail, it's doomed to exacerbate human suffering. And as I was reading your book, you're talking about fictional works that exist in an imaginary world, so to speak, and yet their point is to align us with realities that the author didn't invent.
That's exactly right. The idea of literature or art being an imitation, of course, goes all the way back to the ancients, and that is what its purpose is. Of course, that imitation can be, can be applied very broadly. I mean, even a work of fantasy is still imitating reality,
Sure.
and if it doesn't do that well, then it's not going to resonate with us. But and literature and art is not a sermon, so that's something that confuses a lot of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
It reflects reality by imitating reality, and in real life, people don't go around, with placards saying "I'm a loser," I'm going to cheat on you, I'm going to break your heart, or I'm a good person. I mean, that's just not how life works. And so the best literature just simply sort of recreates our experience by leaving room for interpretation. And there is meaning there, just as there is in real life, but good artists don't have to set that meaning up or plant it in there or hide it. They just use the craft of words to recreate the kind of meaning that is embedded in real life around us.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor, says this is a paraphrase, not a quote, but the eye is an organ of judgment, and that our the sensing part of our brain and the judging part of our brains aren't as far apart as we tend to think they are. And so, in fiction, the author presents experience to us hopefully in the way that it comes to us in real life, and sets our judging apparatus to work, which is why fiction is so effective as a way of preparing us for life.
Yes, exactly. And that's why, there are different kinds of literary experiences that do that, and others that do something else, which isn't necessarily bad.
Right.
But, a beach read or a romance, that's more like watching a television show. And again, that's not bad, but the craft of literature and literary fiction and poetry are all doing something different. And that's what I think also confuses a lot of people.
Are there ways that specific stories have changed the way you look at the world? I mean, I'm assuming the answer to that is yes. Can you?
Sure. Oh, where to begin? Well, I usually my go-to is probably Jane Eyre. I mean, Jane Eyre was just one of those early works of great literature that grabbed me. Going back to our earlier part of our conversation, probably the most distinct feature of that novel is the voice of the narrator. It's a strong, coherent, compelling voice. And it's a lot of people don't realize that it's actually, it's not just a romance. I mean, there are romantic elements in it, but it is really the story of a Christian soul finding her way home, finding her, who she is.
Yeah.
And then in utter contrast to that, if virtue is moderating between the extremes, I've got that going on because I just love Jane Austen. And again, something that a lot of people don't get about Austen is she's anti-romantic. She's satirical. And so there are lots of voices actually in her novels because she slips in and out of different perspectives of the characters she's satirizing or identifying with. And you really have to pay attention when you're reading Austen. You just get lost in the story because she's constantly demanding us to figure out whose perspective is relaying this information, and are we supposed to trust it or are we supposed to reject it? So that kind of writing has definitely had a formative role in the way that I think and write and perceive the world, with a little bit of cynicism and satire. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, in Austen, you have this. It seems to me the right kind of ironic distance from the world. Like the Christian position is one of ironic distance. The right kind of ironic distance, the one that says, "Hey, I'm not going to take this world as seriously as the world insists that I take it."
Right.
And that's
being
an ironic
in the world,
posture.
but not of it. Yeah. That it's a very Christian approach. Yes, we know and understand and experience the world enough that we get it. Austen clearly gets her world and the people in it, yet she's a little bit outside of it, kind of looking at how it can be corrected and what can be, what vices and follies need to be, to be corrected and grappled with. And yet she still you can tell she loves her characters and loves her world. And she's like, yeah.
Yeah. I love the observation you made about the changing perspectives, and our, the readers, I don't want to say responsibility. I mean, I guess we have responsibility, but it's a responsibility we gladly accept of passing judgment on these voices. Which, by the way, is every time anybody says anything to us, we're assessing: are they trustworthy? Do they know what they're talking about? You're always assessing. And
exactly.
Austen makes us do that.
And that's why her work is such a great example of what good literature really does. It recreates reality and allows us to have this experience and sharpens our skills in what we need to do, as you said, all day long with everyone around us, is to assess what they're saying, judge what they're saying, but also to try to understand them and empathize with them too, right? Even our enemies, That's what Austen helps us practice doing.
Can you give me a specific example of how Austen helps us be kind to our enemies?
Yeah, let's see. I'm rereading and writing about Sense and Sensibility right now, and it turns out, it is, as is typical with Austen, that the first sort of dashing romantic male hero turns out to be a villain.
Yeah, right.
Of course, but then later in the story, and this is actually the film version with Emma Thompson is excellent, but it's still very different from the novel in many ways. And so one of the things that the novel does that's not in the film, I don't believe, is a scene where the villain Willoughby comes back and gives an explanation for his bad behavior. Now, it doesn't pardon him. It's not an excuse, but it does change the way we kind of understand and feel a little bit sorry for him. Again, it doesn't excuse him, but it complicates his character and allows us to see that there's something behind that villainy. There's a person who's confused and struggling and sorry. It's very powerful.
You have any thoughts on the complexity of villain stories in current stories and movies? And
right, that's a great question. I think there's probably a nuance there, because there's also a tendency in stories and films today for us to be manipulated into cheering for the villain and identifying over much with him, which is obviously not good. But this kind of finer line where we can empathize and understand, yet still not excuse and still not, embrace the evil. That I think I prefer realism over romanticism, and so I think that is a good dose of realism, because that is, we are surrounded by people on the internet, or hopefully in our real lives, who didn't vote the way we vote, and we don't understand why they did what they did or why they're doing what they're doing. And they could be very, very wrong, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of a rationale, a reason, as misguided as it might be. Most people are not as evil as they come across on the internet.
Not even you, Karen.
Not even me.
I've read some things about you on the internet, and
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry for you, Karen, and I do appreciate your voice of reason, even on Twitter. And I'm sorry for the punishment that you have undergone as a result.
Well, thank you.
All right, I'm just gonna throw this quotation out here. We're about to run out of time, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. This is something Christian Wyman said in a piece about the poet Richard Wilbur and Richard Wilbur's apparent mental health. A poet who feeds on pathologies eventually becomes their food. But the issue is larger than that. A culture, too, is a work of imagination, or a failure of it. We are meant to be in a golden age of the television drama, and perhaps we are, but just consider how thoroughly so many of these shows equate misery with authenticity, and how many rely on violence and degradation, usually toward women, to establish character and intensity. I didn't mean to get off on television. I admit to edit that out. But anyway, of course we need art to explore the darkest recesses of our lives and minds, but we also need art to tell us why this world is worth loving and therefore saving. Praise, too, is part of any whole artistic and existential vision. Joy is one kind of courage.
Wow.
Isn't that great? And
that is really great.
And the part that I had meant to focus on before I forgot to cut out the part about television dramas is the idea that a culture is a work of imagination or a failure of imagination, and that in the culture we're in now, joy is very much a kind of courage. And so, anyway, again, I know that's not a question. The question is, what do you think about that quote, Karen? Isn't that the worst interview question ever?
Yeah. No. I mean, this is the most important point, I think, and yes, the whole conversation. I'll point to this is the role of the imagination in creating. Imagination is not about escaping, and into flights of fancy and then returning to, but imagination literally is the image or impression that we have of what is around us and that we carry with us based on what we have seen, and all of that has to do with attention. There's something earlier in the conversation where I thought to bring up this point of attention, because because we were talking about writers who are reflecting the world around us, but they're being selective, right? Because they're paying attention to certain things more than other things, which is what we also do, when we're walking down the street or driving in our cars or walking across walk in Nashville and getting hit by a bus or whatever. We can't pay attention to everything, yet we can train our attention to focus on negative things or positive things, and we don't want to be in denial, but it is a work of imagination to choose joy, and that is a courageous act today. I love that quote.
There's the question of not just what's true, but what's truer and what's truest, right? There are lots of things that are true in the world, but some things are a little truer than others.
Yes.
All right, Karen, last question. Who are the writers who make you want to write?
Oh, it's easy. Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah. Correct answer.
Yeah, she just, she sees the world and reflects it and pays attention to it in a way that I want to do. Even if I'm not writing that, I want to pay attention to the world in the way that she does, and I want to reflect that. She's probably number one on my list.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and again, Jane Austen. Again, I wouldn't be writing about Regency England, but her ability to do the things that we talked about before, to kind of be in the world but not of it, to love her world but critique it. That's what I want to do as well with my writing.
Yeah. Well, Karen, from your writing, I can tell that's true. That you love the world and you want to critique it. And so, thank you for your voice in this culture, and may your tribe increase. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.